Ready to dish the textbook version of George Washington.
Oh, yeah.
We're going deep on the man behind the powdered wig today, and you might be surprised to hear our main source is Wikipedia.
It's really amazing how much fascinating information is right there, like right in plain sight.
Right.
We're not digging through dusty archives today. We're just looking at some pretty familiar facts about Washington's life to uncover, some hopefully surprising insights about his leadership.
So we all know the basics. George Washington, born 1732, Westmoreland County, Virginia. But here's where things get kind of interesting. His upbringing wasn't your typical founding father origin story.
No, not at all. Think about it. Rural Virginia, plantation life.
Right.
This wasn't a bustling city filled with, political debate and all this stuff. Washington's world was tied to the land, and he actually had less formal education than some of his brothers.
Which makes his self-taught skills even more impressive.
Oh, absolutely.
Surveying, map making. The guy even had a thing for grammar.
Yeah.
Creating his own rules of civility. Talk about attention to detail.
I mean, those rules of civility are such a goldmine when you think about it. These weren't just like stuffy guidelines. These were his personal code of conduct, showing this real drive for self-improvement that really went beyond just book smarts.
Yeah. And that drive probably fueled his early military ambitions, too.
Yeah.
Right? You have to figure his half-brother Lawrence, serving in the militia, made a huge impact on young George.
Huge impact, yeah. Lawrence became kind of a role model for George, igniting this passion for military service that led him right into the thick of the French and Indian War at just 22 years old.
Okay, so picture this. 22-year-old Washington gets a major promotion in the Virginia militia. He's tasked with this diplomatic mission to the French, which, spoiler alert, goes about as smoothly as a greased cannonball.
To put it mildly, it's Humber. What's so fascinating isn't just that the mission failed, but that Washington's actions inadvertently helped spark the entire French and Indian War.
Gee, crazy.
Talk about high stakes.
Yeah. And those early experiences in the war, both the victories and the devastating losses, were absolutely crucial in shaping Washington's leadership style. This wasn't some abstract political debate for him. This was life and death on the frontier.
Exactly. He saw firsthand those tensions between, the British, the French, and the Native American tribes. And you can bet those experiences really informed his later decisions during the Revolution.
Oh, for sure. But here's something I always found curious. Even with all that military experience, Washington still desired a royal commission in the British Army. He was denied repeatedly. It makes you wonder if that rejection fueled his later desire for an independent America.
Yeah, it's a good question, right? Was it ambition? Was it resentment? Or was it something more complex? A growing realization that the colonies deserved a different path. It adds a very fascinating layer, I think, to his relationship with the crown.
Right. Whatever the reason, when the Revolution arrived, Washington was thrust onto the center stage once again this time as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army.
Yeah.
No pressure, right?
Yeah. Leading a ragtag group of soldiers against the most powerful military force in the world. That's a lot of pressure.
Yeah.
And remember, not everyone believed he was up to the task. There were doubts. There were whispers.
But Washington had a knack for silencing his critics. The crossing of the Delaware is a perfect example. A desperate, daring gamble that could have ended in disaster.
But instead, it became this brilliant strategic maneuver that revived the spirits of the Continental Army just when they needed it most. And it's one thing to read about it in a textbook, but imagine the sheer audacity, the freezing cold, the knowledge that defeat could mean the end of the revolution.
And speaking of bold moves, let's talk about smallpox inoculation.
Oh, yeah.
This wasn't just some medical decision. This was Washington defying Congress itself because he understood the strategic importance of a healthy army.
It was very controversial, too, at the time. Inoculation was a risky procedure, but Washington's willingness to embrace a then unconventional method to protect his troops really speaks volumes about his pragmatism and his dedication to the cause.
It's clear he was a man of action. But even brilliant leaders face crushing setbacks.
Right.
The betrayal of Benedict Arnold must have been a devastating blow, both personally and strategically.
Oh, absolutely. This wasn't just a military loss. It was a betrayal of trust that cut very deep. Washington had placed immense faith in Arnold. And, the revelation of his treachery forced him to confront these harsh realities of leadership during wartime.
To talk about a test of character. And speaking of tests, the Southern Campaign and the victory at Yorktown cemented Washington's place in history. But we often forget that this victory relied heavily on the French alliance, on the strategic advice of General Rochambeau.
You're right. That's a good reminder that even the most iconic figures don't achieve greatness alone. Washington was a skilled strategist, but he also knew how to leverage the strengths of his allies, which is a very crucial skill for any leader.
So we've got the war hero, the strategic mastermind, but how did those experiences shape Washington's approach to something completely new, leading a nation as its first president?
That's where things get really interesting. Because Washington wasn't just the first president, he was essentially writing the job description in real time.
Right.
Even something as simple as choosing to be called Mr. President was a very deliberate move away from monarchy and towards a new kind of leadership.
And let's not forget the two-term tradition.
Oh, yeah.
Can you imagine the uproar if he tried to hold on to power like some of the monarchs he'd fought against?
I mean, Washington understood that his actions had a weight that went beyond his own presidency. He was setting precedents, building the very foundations of a government based on the consent of the governed. That's legacy in action.
But those early years of the nation weren't without their share of drama. I mean, imagine being stuck in the middle of Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton as they duked it out in the first cabinet.
It's almost comical to think about. These were brilliant, passionate minds with such clashing ideologies, and Washington had to navigate all those tensions while holding the new nation together.
Talk about a leadership challenge. Makes you wonder, how did he do it? What can we learn from Washington's approach to conflict, especially in such a volatile political climate? Well, I think it's safe to say that Washington had a knack for handling conflict, and he wasn't afraid to take a stand when he needed to, even if it meant ruffling some feathers along the way.
Yeah, the Whiskey Rebellion is a perfect example.
Right.
It doesn't exactly scream like epic showdown, but this whole rebellion over a tax on whiskey, it was a defining moment for the new nation.
Because it really tested the government's authority right. Farmers refusing to pay taxes, Washington personally leading troops to enforce the law. It showed that he was serious about building a strong federal government.
Yeah. It wasn't just about whiskey. It was about establishing the principle that the federal government had the power to actually enforce its laws, which was a very crucial step in those early years.
It really makes you realize how much we take for granted today. But even as Washington was building this new nation, he was grappling with some of the same issues that still haunt us. Native American relations, for example, were a minefield of diplomacy and, let's be honest, often brutal expansion.
Yeah, it's a difficult but essential part of his story to acknowledge. I mean, Washington did attempt to negotiate treaties with Native American tribes, but he also presided over policies that ultimately led to their displacement and dispossession from their land.
Right. It's a stark reminder that even the most revered historical figures were products of their time, wrestling with, the complexities and contradictions of their era.
Absolutely, and that complexity unfortunately extends to the issue of slavery as well.
Yeah.
Here we have Washington, a man who personally opposed slavery on a moral level, yet benefited from the system his entire life.
It's almost hard to fathom today.
Right. It's this moral quagmire that I think many of the founding fathers really struggled with.
He clearly recognized the inherent injustice of slavery, even expressing a desire for its abolition. Yet he remained entangled in the very system that he abhorred.
Which is what makes his decision to free his slaves in his will all the more significant. It was a really powerful statement, I think, acknowledging the wrongfulness of slavery, even as he grappled with his own place in that deeply flawed society.
Right. It's a reminder that progress isn't always this straight line.
Yeah.
It's messy, it's complicated.
Yeah.
And it often involves, wrestling with these deeply uncomfortable truths.
Yeah.
About ourselves and about our history.
Yeah, precisely. And that's why it's so crucial to approach history with nuance, to see these figures not as like these flawless heroes, but as complex human beings, grappling with these really immense challenges.
It makes you wonder, would we judge them differently if we could transport them to today's world?
Yeah.
Or would they still make the same choices?
That's the beauty of history. It keeps us asking those questions and challenging our own assumptions and pushing us to engage with the past in these really meaningful ways.
Okay, so we've talked about the big picture, the wars, the presidency, the legacy. But I'm curious, what was Washington actually like as a person? Behind the stoic facade, what kind of man was he?
Well, contrary to popular belief, he wasn't just this stern, unsmiling figure, He was known for his composure, his quiet intensity, but he also had a lighter side to him. He loved to dance, he's an avid horseman, and he had this kind of surprising passion for grammar.
Of course.
Remember those rules of civility?
It's kind of endearing, isn't it?
Yeah.
This larger-than-life figure meticulously outlining, like, proper table manners and social etiquette. It
Yeah.
just goes to show that even the father of our country had his quirks.
Yeah, and those quirks are what make him relatable, right? He
Yeah.
wasn't just a marble statue. He was a human being with passions, with interests, even dentures.
Don't forget the dentures.
Right.
They weren't made of wood like that old myth. But still,
Right.
it humanizes him a bit, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely.
Mm.
It's easy to forget that these historical figures dealt with everyday problems just like we do. They got sick, they aged, they probably even complained about the weather.
Oh, I'm sure.
It's those little details that kind of remind us of their humanity.
So we've got this complex, sometimes contradictory figure. A military leader, a president, a man of his time wrestling with impossible dilemmas. But what about Washington's lasting legacy? How do we reconcile those flaws with the image of the man who's first in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Washington's legacy is so deeply intertwined with the founding of America. He's a symbol of democracy, of independence, of the ideals upon which this nation was built. But as we've been talking about, that legacy is also intertwined with some of the darker aspects of American history.
Right.
Slavery, displacement of Native Americans, the very systems that contradicted those founding ideals.
Exactly. And we can't ignore those uncomfortable truths. It's about holding those two seemingly disparate ideas in our minds at the same time, acknowledging the immense contributions of these historical figures while also grappling with, the full scope of their actions.
It's a lot to process.
It is.
Yeah.
And it raises so many questions. Can we separate the man from the historical context? Is it even possible to admire Washington's leadership while also condemning some of the systems that he upheld?
Right. Those are questions I think each of us has to wrestle with individually. There's no easy answer. There's no single right way to view these really complex historical figures.
And that's what makes this so fascinating, right? It's not about, just memorizing dates and names. It's about really engaging in a conversation about our past that's still so relevant for us today.
Absolutely. Because understanding the nuances of Washington's story, the triumphs and the failures, helps us, I think, to better understand the complexities of our own time.
So as we kind of wrap up our deep dive into the world of George Washington, what are some of the key takeaways you hope our listener walks away with today?
I think for me, it's the importance of looking beyond the surface. We started with something as accessible as Wikipedia, but I think we uncovered these really interesting layers of complexity that challenge, I think, the traditional narrative.
Yeah.
It reminds us that history isn't static.
Right.
It's this conversation that's constantly evolving as we uncover new perspectives and new interpretations.
And that active engagement is key. It's not enough to just passively consume information. We have to be willing to question, to analyze, to connect the dots between the past and the present.
Exactly. Just like those rules of civility we talked about earlier, it's about a commitment to self-improvement, to constantly seeking a deeper understanding of ourselves and the world around us.
Well said. And on that note, I want to thank you, our listener, for joining us on this deep dive into the life and legacy of George Washington. We've covered a lot of ground today, from his rural upbringing to his monumental achievements, and we've really only just scratched the surface.
So keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep the conversation going. Because as Washington himself once said, let your heart feel for the afflictions and distress of everyone. Even centuries later, his words offer a really powerful reminder of our shared humanity and the importance of empathy in a world that often feels increasingly divided.
I completely agree. And on that note, we'll be back next time with another deep dive into history's hidden corners. Until then, keep exploring.